The disturbing truth about Nazi wives after WW2 history remembers the men who shaped the Nazi regime, but far fewer people know what happened to the women who stood beside them. Wives who once lived in luxury, surrounded by influence and privilege, suddenly found themselves facing a world that no longer feared their husband's power. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, these women were forced to confront a new reality, one marked by loss, punishment, and the brutal unraveling of everything they once believed in. Their lives had been built on loyalty. Their identities had been shaped by a system that rose quickly and fell even faster. And when that world burned, many of them fell with it. Today, we revisit the final moments, desperate choices, and haunting aftermaths faced by the wives of some of the most influential figures in Nazi Germany. If you appreciate deep historical breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe for more powerful content every week. The collapse of the Nazi regime in 1945 was more than a military defeat. It was the total destruction of a world built on power, belief, and fear. And standing just behind the men who enforced that rule were the women who lived inside its walls. Some were loyal supporters. Others were silent companions. A few were true believers until the very end. But when Germany crumbled, all of them faced consequences they had never imagined. Among them, Magda Goebbels remains the most chilling example of loyalty taken to an unthinkable extreme. Married to Joseph Goebbels, the man who shaped propaganda for an entire nation, Magda became a symbol of the regime's ideal woman, elegant, committed, and unwavering in her devotion to Hitler. She attended gatherings, appeared at rallies, and raised her 6 children as though they belonged to a cause greater than her family. When the walls of Berlin began to close, Magda didn't flee. She followed Hitler into the Führerbunker, bringing her young children with her. While generals panicked and aides prepared to escape, she stayed calm, convinced that life outside the Nazi vision was not worth living. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler took his own life. And the very next day, Magda made a choice that stunned even hardened military officers. She gently put her children to sleep. Some reports say she gave them sedatives first, and then helped administer cyanide. One by one, all 6 children died in their beds. Minutes later, Magda and Joseph ended their own lives. Their bodies were burned near the Reich Chancellery, leaving behind a legacy of devotion that crossed into the darkest realm of fanaticism. But Magda was not alone in sacrifice. Others tried desperately to escape the collapsing Reich, none more dramatically than Margarete Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler. She came from a respectable background, raised to value discipline and national pride. She admired the Nazi elite and believed deeply in the system, even writing letters filled with praise for Hitler and support for her husband's work. Yet when the war ended, Margarete became a target. Heinrich Himmler attempted to flee under a false name, but British troops captured him. Once they realized who he was, he used a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth to avoid facing trial. Margarete, meanwhile, was arrested weeks later. She insisted she knew nothing of the horrors committed by her husband, but investigators read her letters and diaries, documents showing that she was deeply tied to Nazi ideology. In 1948, a German court labeled her a major offender, a damning legal category. She served several years in custody, and after her release, she vanished into anonymity, living quietly until her death. Not all Nazi wives faced clear punishment. Some lived with wounds that were psychological, not judicial. None illustrates this more than Gerda Bormann, married to Martin Bormann, Hitler's closest advisor. When Berlin fell, Martin Bormann vanished completely. For decades, rumors swirled. Had he escaped to South America? Was he hiding under a new identity? Gerda believed he was still alive. She raised their 10 children alone, refusing to accept that he was gone. But in truth, Martin Bormann died in May 1945 while trying to flee Berlin. His remains weren't found until 1972. Gerda never lived long enough to get closure. She died in 1946, still waiting for the husband who would never return. Some women remained loyal long after the war. Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, dedicated her entire life to defending her husband's legacy. Rudolf had flown solo to Scotland in 1941, claiming he wanted to negotiate peace. Instead, he was captured and later sentenced to life in prison after the war. Ilse insisted he had acted honorably, spending decades writing books, giving interviews, and arguing that he was misunderstood. She never renounced her beliefs. She died still fighting for the reputation of a man the world saw as responsible for vast suffering. But loyalty was not universal. Amelie Schindler, wife of Oskar Schindler, the industrialist who saved more than 1,000 Jewish people, was one of the rare women who opposed the cruelty around her. While Oskar has been celebrated worldwide, Emily supported workers in secret, hiding the vulnerable, bringing them food, and risking her life quietly. After the war, she lived far from fame, alone in Argentina, largely forgotten until her story resurfaced decades later. Others clung to the ideology long after the ruins settled. Lena Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, remained fiercely loyal. Even in the 1970s, she spoke proudly of her husband. She tried to rewrite history, casting him as a misunderstood leader rather than a central figure in one of the darkest operations of the era. On the opposite end of the spectrum, silence became the refuge for women like Elizabeth Speer, wife of Albert Speer. While her husband admitted guilt at Nuremberg, she refused to participate publicly. She didn't defend him, but she didn't condemn him either. She lived quietly until her death, preferring obscurity over confrontation. Some women faced consequences not through courts, but through shame. Annie Brandt, widowed when her husband, Rudolf Brandt, was executed for his role in horrific medical experiments, found herself ostracized. She disappeared, refusing interviews or public life, unable to escape the shadow of her husband's crimes. Even those who were not wives, but were close witnesses, carried lifelong guilt. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, spent her life questioning what she could have known, what she should have seen, and whether ignorance was itself a form of complicity. Her later interviews offer a rare human glimpse into the psychological aftermath suffered by those who worked inside the Nazi machine. Others, like Henriette von Schirach, once admired the Nazi royalty lifestyle. After the war, she denounced her past, writing about how easily she was swept up by power and illusion. And then there were those who tried to disappear entirely, like Käthe Dönitz, who remained invisible for the rest of her life after her husband led Germany in Hitler's final days. These stories remind us that the collapse of a regime does not end the suffering it creates. For many of these women, the fall of 1945 marked the beginning of a long struggle with shame, identity, and the moral wreckage of a world they once embraced. Their fates remind us that when a system of power dies, the shadows it leaves behind continue to haunt those who once lived within it.